Hockey's got to be one of the best fantasy sports out there. And today we're going to walk through 15 pro tips on how to win at NHL DFS. Going to go through all of these proven ways that I've found over the years to win on DraftKings Hockey. It all starts today, so stick around. Correlation is everything in NHL DFS. If you listen to one of these videos, just make sure that you pay very close attention to that, because correlation is really something that can help you get to the top of GPPs, but it can also just really limit the amount of decisions that you have to make. Like, I want to make sure that I have to make as little decisions as possible. I'm wrong all the time. I want to make sure that if I really feel good about a game environment, about a matchup, that I really benefit from that. So correlation really helps out with that sort of thing. You want to try and correlate your skaters at even strength and on the power play whenever possible. Ideally both, but you won't always get those type of scenarios. But similarly to MLB, you want to really target guys that are in similar spots of the batting order so that you really try and get more plate appearances overall, more volume. So obviously in an ideal situation, you're really trying to correlate two hockey players together at even strength. They score an even strength goal, great. You might get an assist on that as well, but also on the power play. But you won't always get those scenarios. So a couple of different stacking kind of options that I typically do would be an even strength 3-man stack. So winger, center, winger. Pretty simple there. And ideally, again, they're on the power play as well. But if you wanted to stick to just a power play stack, one of the ones that I've really implemented in 2019 that I like is rolling 2 forwards and a defenseman. So just a nice 3-man stack there. I think you can add in another forward as well, since most teams are probably rolling out just one defenseman on the power play these days. So you'll get probably a decent amount of correlation at even strength, but also if that power play is just in an amazing spot, you should be able to capture that upside there. But I think another kind of undervalued way to stack is just to make sure that you get some of these little mini stacks in play as well. So if you like a team that might have kind of a lower implied total, but the really undervalued in terms of their salary, maybe just a little mini stack that you kind of correlate with a cheap winger, for example, since we're always trying to pay down at winger. So really just grabbing a little bit of a smaller even strength stack just to give you that little bump that I definitely think can kind of get you at least over the cash line in certain scenarios, smaller slates, that sort of thing. The last stack that I think that I should always mention is the onslaught. So let's see how many guys we can get from one team, especially on slates where it's just there's not as many games available. So I roll out a ton of onslaughts, 2-game, 3-game, even 4-game slates, especially if I think there's one spot that really stands above the rest. You want to give yourself all the guys, all the dudes. You want to play them all, just because I think that if there ends up being 4 or 5 goals, you want to give yourself as much access to those points as you can if you think the other games are going to be a little bit lower scoring. This will be a scenario where I would probably add my goalie to that stack as well. So if that stack's going to go completely nuts, 4 or 5 goals, I would imagine you're probably in a pretty good position to get the win as well. So onslaught stacks with basically 2 one-offs is definitely something I think is getting more and more viable. And depending on how strong you feel about your one-off strategy, definitely think it's something you can roll out on large slates as well. Be thoughtful with how you use ownership projections in NHL DFS, because hockey is probably one of the best GPP sports there is on DraftKings and FanDuel, because ownership's almost always going to range and be spread out kind of in that 15 to 20% range on any given slate. You're going to get guys at even 25% regularly that are some of the chalkiest plays on the entire slate. Whereas you look at any other sport, something like NBA, you could see guys reach 60, 70% owned, and they're basically some of the best spots of the night. But in NHL, some of those spots might actually go rather under-owned what they should be. In other sports, you're going to be using Vegas totals to kind of determine whether the game's going to be a blowout, who's favored, who's going to play, what kind of explosive games there are going to be. You do similar things with hockey. The only real difference is in hockey, you really don't have to worry about a blowout a ton. If a team's going to be up by 4 or 5 goals, you might see the Stars kind of limit themselves a little bit, maybe a minute or two compared to what they normally would be at the end of a game. But it's not like it is in NBA where you might get completely removed from a game. If Vegas totals or games are extremely high, you can expect a higher explosive scoring game that might be up tempo, but those lines are far from gospel, guys. It's really just a spot where most people are going to start their lineup building process with those Vegas lines. But more often than not, we do see a decent consistency spike in games where a team's implied for over 3.5 goals, at least in the research that I've done. But from like a game theory perspective, it's something I really enjoy a lot in terms of the tournament side of things. I definitely think that it's kind of nice to even go past that top tier of implied totals and really kind of attack those teams just outside of the top ones of the entire night, because they still might be in really good spots, but you'll get significantly lower ownership on those type of teams. Maybe you grab a team on the road that's implied for a few less points as well. Can really make all the difference when really see ownership kind of cluster towards the top one or two implied totals of the entire night. But in a sport like hockey where there's so much randomness involved, I really want to grab that ownership discount when I can, even if it's not as significant as some other sports. Your one-off plays in NHL DFS, your fillers, the guys that go around your stacks, you got to make sure they can hit value all on their own. And I think that there's a couple different ways you can go about making your one-off plays be successful in NHL. And I think that the first way is target just a high volume shooter. So a guy that always comes to mind as the perfect one-off play is Mike Hoffman for the Florida Panthers. I do think that he's someone that does generate a ton of shot attempts basically in any game he's ever in. He can also be someone that's really featured on the power play and really can get there on his own. Doesn't need people to elevate him. Maybe if he's a guy that really just kind of needs to get an assist and a goal to truly get there because he doesn't have the peripherals, those guys just really don't make good one-offs in my opinion. So I think that Hoffman's a really good example, maybe an elite centerman that definitely maybe is on like an elite team. So someone like Jack Eichel, someone that really could hit that 5-shot block bonus, could score a goal in any game, even if he has a really low implied total. You might not necessarily want to stack up the Buffalo Sabres, but if you wanted to one-off with Eichel, I think that makes a certain amount of sense. But from a defensive perspective, that is where I think it does get a little bit more nuanced. So I think that you can pay down at times for a one-off defenseman who you feel like is a pretty strong bet to get the block bonus because he can hit value even if he doesn't really get at a point or doesn't really have that ceiling performance, especially if the price is right. So I think that paying all the way down for a defenseman really makes some sense as a one-off play because it doesn't really affect the rest of your team too much. Just probably gets you to some of the studs in your stack that you might need. And I also think that if you can help it, getting up to an elite defenseman actually as a one-off, someone like Roman Josi, who can certainly get there on his own, makes a ton of sense. Maybe you have a cheaper stack and you end up with a decent amount of salary left over after you have both of your main core correlation plays set. I think really getting up to one of those elite guys as a one-off can kind of differentiate your lineup a decent amount, but still give you a lot of ceiling as well for someone that can get there on his own. Popular stacks. I think that especially on a slate that's big, you really don't need to look at teams that are super poor from a stacking perspective typically, unless you're really trying to leverage the field in a large tournament. But I think that there might be pieces of those teams that you could still want anyways. It all depends on pricing. It depends on the scarcity involved in each positions as well. If you really wanted to try and get cute and grab a winger that's still playing in the top 6 and he's going to be the Stoneman price, but he's going to play on the first or second line and power play minutes for a team that's implied for not a lot of goals, you might still want to take a peek at something like that. I think there's also scenarios later in the year where we'll get some guys that are coming up from the American League on poor teams that might have been studs in the American League. If at the very least they're going to be shooters from the American League that might be, again, playing in the top 6, playing on the power play, really getting a shot for these teams that might not have really high implied totals, or maybe they're just on the road. Something like that might go overlooked, but can really help you if there's not a lot of great value on the slate. So you might not want to stack a full line, like I said. Maybe it's a team like Dallas where you really want to try and get that correlation at even strength and on the power play, but maybe you'll find one player on a team like Anaheim. It's just way too cheap for what you're going to get out of them relative to the peripherals, relative to their role overall. And it depends on the position. Now, we talk about paying down at winger quite a bit, but you can kind of peg them in as a one-off around 2 other stacks that's just not going to be owned. It can really act as a really nice differentiator for you as well. If you have some chalky stacks, if they end up going off, they end up being that piece that you really need that helps you pass other teams that might have a chalkier stock that you have as well. So if you really want to take advantage of a mispricing or something like that, in cash games, it makes sense as well. If you just want to prioritize a little bit more floor, maybe it's just a mid-range option that's just way too cheap. Someone like Patrick Hornquist, maybe he's 5,300, and you think his peripherals tell you that he should be a mid-6K player. Maybe he makes a reasonable one-off or something like that, but maybe Pittsburgh's on the road in a really tough matchup against Tampa Bay or Boston, but you really want to try and grab the floor of a winger that's actually going to block some shots like Hornquist. So those are the type of things that I'd be thinking about, but I'm not just Xing out these players right away, especially towards the end of the year when, again, we're going to have signings from college hockey, but we're also going to have guys coming up from the American League. We really want to try and take advantage of that value, and that can come on any team. In general, it makes sense to pay down at the winger position in NHL DFS because the landscape of this game has changed. I do think that this DraftKings scoring that has kind of given bonuses to 5 shots on goal to 3 blocks has really changed everything in terms of position scarcity overall, because just the nature of the winger position, they're rarely going to be a threat to hit the block bonus anyway. So in my opinion, just because it's so important to hit those bonuses overall, you want to at least give yourself a chance. Now, centermen aren't going to hit it as often as a lot of defensemen will either, but we can still get more volume typically from targeting centers and defensemen and just paying up for those positions for their truly elite peripheral guys that can really hit that double bonus. A guy like Austin Matthews is a center position. He can get you 5 shots on goal. He can get you a goal and assist. He can also get you the block bonuses. That's the true ceiling. If you miss out on that ceiling game from Austin Matthews, even if he ends up only getting 1 point but double bonuses, it's really going to be tough to catch him in terms of really a winger that's never going to give you that block shot bonus. While it's really nice on certain slates to target guys like Alexander Ovechkin, elite goal scorers, or maybe someone like Patrick Kane, someone that's going to give you a lot of volume from a shooting perspective. Sure, there's smaller slates. I think it makes more sense to go after those guys, but a larger slate, when these peripherals really matter, and maybe we're just looking at some one-offs in general, I want to target someone that can truly get me both of those bonuses, right? So the way that I typically pay down at winger is by targeting some of those guys that are $3,500 and below. They're going to play in the top 6. They're still going to get their minutes. They're still going to be kind of a decent addition to a stack. So correlation at winger, guys that, yeah, we still want to target shots. Of course, we want to get someone that can hit us that shot bonus. But I think that paying down and really just adding a little bit more correlation is normally what I try and do with the cheaper wingers, which just allows me to pay up the elite peripherals, Brent Burns, Roman Josi, those type of guys. Talking about Austin Matthews, I probably play Austin Matthews more than anyone on DraftKings, and that's part of the reason, because it really limits your floor, but also really limits your ceiling if you don't have a guy that at least can threaten for one of those now and then. Choose defensemen who can threaten for the block bonus on DraftKings every night if you want to be a successful NHL DFS player. Because sure, blocks, obviously they don't have the upside at giving you a chance at getting a goal, but taking that a step further, you don't have the upside of potentially getting assist off a rebound either. But what blocks do give you is that added floor when it's not always priced in. With these new DK bonuses, it can actually give some of these cheap assets a higher ceiling than they have ever had before as well. That said, these elite shot blockers, totally fine on their own, but I'm not always interested in rostering a guy that's in the 95th, 99th percentile in blocks if he doesn't give me any shot upside or time on ice upside as well. It's fine for floor. The ceiling just isn't always anywhere near where it is if you find a guy that can give you both. The problem is a lot of times that you get these guys that are heavily reduced in price points, so it sort of removes that need for ceiling. If it's a smaller slate, maybe you can get that block bonus, or you have a guy that's eating a ton of minutes. A guy like Racco Gudas, Jonas Brodin, probably a better example. Jonas Brodin, the type of player that he's going to play 24, 25 minutes. He's got a chance to get you 2 to 5 blocks every single night. He's one of the true defensive specialists out there, but does have a little bit of offensive ability as well. Even if he didn't, you wouldn't necessarily care as much about the upside if he's around 3,500, 2,800, a lower price point. You can find some of these guys that are elite at blocking shots, but if the price point is right, you can sort of give them that outside chance to back into an assist. And then at that point, they're a really strong differentiator for you as a way to save salary if the slate is especially thin at the top end, or maybe the top end centermen are a priority on a given slate. I just wouldn't get carried away with it. Sometimes, if anything, you can kind of get an idea of a D-man might even be close to being priced out at the top end. Someone like John Carlson, at times, he can be inconsistent in terms of his shot blocking assets, but almost always these guys are the type of people that I'll guess really only play in stacks, because if he doesn't have that ceiling floor combo that merits that high price tag, unless he gets a couple points, he's really not that good for you as a one-off. Whereas someone like Roman Josi, Brent Burns, they can totally hit value on their own and make a fantastic D-man to pay up for as a one-off around your stack. So that's what I'm really focused on, is really trying to target guys that can get me that block bonus every single night, especially if I'm paying up at D. Stack up shot opportunities in NHL DFS, because we need to figure out ways to project which teams are going to take a lot of shots, which teams are going to give up a lot of shots. We talk about peripheral stats a ton in the DFS space, and in NHL, so important because goals in general are just so high variance. And one thing I think we can all agree on, at least in theory, is the more shots you take, the more chances you're going to have to score goals. At the very least, the more shots you take, the more fantasy points you're going to put up on DraftKings. So if you have a team that generates high Corsi, for example, and Corsi is just a fancy word for shot attempts, by the way, against a team that maybe gives up a pile of shots or gives up a pile of Corsi, it's really just one of the best ways of determining if a game is going to be played up in pace, or if there's going to be a lot of opportunities in that given game for our fantasy assets, or for our purposes, just teams that could hit their ceiling if you wanted to stack them up and play them in a GPP. So in general, if you look at that type of thing and you see a team that gives up a massive amount of shots, it's an even better spot than it would normally be if there's another spot that has a similar Vegas total for that team, maybe in a worse shooting matchup overall. So that's kind of those tiebreakers you'll use when you're trying to figure out what teams to stack or stack against. One of those teams is Toronto. It's a great example. They give up a lot of shots. They also take a lot of shots on the other side. So games happen to be up in tempo, a lot of up and down. And when things go bad for Toronto, they do kind of go bad defensively. So let's just say that Toronto is a heavy favorite on that night. It doesn't necessarily mean that the other team isn't going to get chances as well. We really want to focus on high danger chances, which we'll get to at another level. But I do think that they're a good example. Another one, Colorado, they actually don't give up a lot of shots, but they give up a ton of goals, which is interesting. And those are situations that I'm not necessarily chasing, honestly. I'm never chasing efficiency in NHL. We haven't touched on it a ton yet, but the most important thing is to stack up those shots, block shots. Chasing goals is a great way to lose money in NHL, if I'm being completely honest, because it's just a difference between if we were to get sort by goals over the past month. Colorado has been giving up a ton of goals, not a ton of shots. Maybe there's a team like Anaheim. They're giving up a similar number of goals, but they're actually giving up almost 10 more Corsi per game. I'd be much more interested in attacking a team with a stack with a spot like Anaheim versus a team like Colorado from that perspective. The goal is always going to be to try and target those peripheral situations that will give us that ceiling and that floor. We really want to target these teams at the tails, either really good or really bad in certain scenarios, or at least avoid them in certain scenarios. I want to really try and nail that home. Good Corsi situations, we'll target this on the data sheet a ton in our community. I want to make sure that they at least have a solid expectation. I'll give you guys one more example. Let's talk about Winnipeg. Say they have a 3.5 implied goal total. They haven't been taking a ton of shots lately offensively, but they're playing against a team like San Jose. San Jose is a team that limits a ton of shots, but they do provide a lot of high danger opportunities. So on a large slate, maybe a bottom 5 in their Corsi against over the past month, San Jose is kind of a tough matchup overall for a team like Winnipeg, because they're really going to have to rely on that efficiency, even though they're a high flying offense. Those are situations that make me a little bit nervous. It's not that I avoid them completely, but they definitely have a lower floor. Efficiency spots can get you into trouble, especially if you're paying up for some high priced options or assets in those games. Doesn't mean they can't get there, doesn't mean they can't score 5 goals, but they're going to have less opportunities to do so. Hockey is an event-based sport, just like MLB, but targeting peripheral stats is absolutely crucial for both floor and ceiling in NHL DFS. We want players who are going to provide volume, and in hockey, that's players who can stack up shots on goal and block shots. We know how valuable it is to hit those 5-shot and 3-block bonuses in terms of the DraftKings scoring changes this past year. We want players that consistently generate a ton of peripheral stats. It's really the best way to build in that floor first. So you build in that consistency. Hopefully you end up getting goals and assists as more of a luxury. It's just like touchdowns in NFL. We're not necessarily chasing touchdown scores. We're really just chasing volume overall. And I still think that's the best way to go about playing NHL DFS, is target shooters first. Maybe it equates to more like chasing home runs in MLB. I think the problem is that because the events are just so massive in hockey as well, goals and assists might be the equivalent, even if I'm being honest with myself, like 2.5 touchdowns or something in the NFL. But the good news is I actually think that some of the new DraftKings bonuses have helped my play style a little bit. Players that target peripherals kind of can get rewarded, or at least bailed out more often now, because you can hit those bonuses and kind of negate some of the assists that might come through just with people correlating blindly these non-shooters. So another positive with targeting shooters, honestly, it kind of probably goes without saying, but shots can lead to those big events. They lead to those goals. So guys that are going to be shooting, they're going to generate more score points in general. A guy that always kind of comes up in this conversation is Joe Thornton. And maybe this is a little bit of an outdated example, but Joe Thornton in his heyday, very good playmaker. He's going to rack up a ton of assists each and every year. I personally, in NHL DFS, would much rather play a centerman like Boone Jenner, someone who's similarly priced, but is almost always a threat to hit that 5-shot on goal bonus in any game, even if he doesn't get on the score sheet. When he does, honestly, Yahtzee, like that's where you're looking for. You're looking for kind of these one-offs that can get there on their own. So I guess that's kind of a differentiating portion of this argument as well. If you really just wanted to add some correlation to a stack, yeah, maybe you sacrifice a little bit of peripherals, but if that isn't a prime concern and you're really just trying to hit on one of these pieces that you're going to insert alongside your stacks, really targeting those peripherals, ideally those ones that lead to those DK bonuses, I would just do that instead of really targeting guys that are pure goal scorers, guys that could rack up assists. I think that that's kind of the order that you would ideally want to get to, because the floor and ceiling is just massively different for that guy that can get you an assist that also can get you one of those bonuses. If a guy gets you an assist but is never a threat to really get you that shot or block bonus, he's really not that valuable if you're trying to take down a GPP. Use later games on the West Coast to your advantage in NHL DFS in terms of really trying to take advantage of late swap on DraftKings if you need to. It's probably something that doesn't get talked about enough, honestly, is really targeting some of these games that start a little bit later on the night. Similar to something like MLB, you'll just get much lower ownership on some of those West Coast games overall. If you wanted to get a prime example, I see this all the time, Edmonton Oilers, they're implied for something like 3.4 goals at home against Chicago. Their game doesn't start until like 10 p.m. Eastern time, something like that. But then you get this other team, say the Washington Capitals, they're implied for slightly more, maybe 3.8 implied goals against Vancouver at home, but their game starts at 7. A lot of people want to watch their players, and if they're not going to be up all night watching the West Coast games, you'll see ownership get inflated for a team like Washington earlier in the slate. It's the type of thing that I'm thinking about each and every night from an ownership perspective. Is just, it's always going to be better to make decisions as the slate is going on, because you have more information on what's happened with both ownership, but also which stacks have gone off so far. My favorite type of slate is when the chalk is right away, the first game, but I also like a team late that might be relatively popular, because if that early chalk goes off, no worries. I'm happy to pivot away from that late night ownership towards a stack that might go overlooked, or maybe just a value play, or that might just be completely unowned. Maybe get someone that I think can get there. He's a good player in a bad matchup, that sort of thing. Because what I'm really trying to do is just make my way back anyways. That's really the only way I'm going to give myself a chance. You always want to give yourself a chance. So that's something that I'm thinking about. On that note, always put the most expensive player in the latest game possible in your utility spot on DraftKings. Of course, it depends a little bit on position scarcity for that night. That's always going to be different where the value is, but just something like using the example above. If we have McDavid in our utility slot late, that gives me the flexibility to pivot to a lower owned player in that spot at another position that I like. Perhaps one that provides a little bit more leverage. Someone like Brent Burns, who can get there right on his own. Maybe he has a tough matchup. I think he's going to be much lower owned than something like McDavid, but I need to catch up. So that'd be a situation where you just want to give yourself a chance. It really only takes this to work for you one time before you realize how plus EV late swap actually is in NHL DFS. Be cognizant of rostering players on the road against elite defensive centermen in NHL DFS, because I do think it's valuable to look at those individual line matchups, because one thing that stands out to me at least is something like if a team like Boston, for example, is at home, they're going to have last change for the Bruins. And I do think that for the people that aren't familiar with hockey, last change essentially means when a team lines up for a faceoff, the home team always has the ability to make the last line change, really get the matchup they want. So if they wanted to get Bergeron, their number one center, against the top line, say they're playing Edmonton, they really want Bergeron against Connor McDavid. Those are situations where a team has completely elite defensive centermen and they're at home. They could take advantage of that and really get those matchups, and it can actually help lock down one of the best players on the other team, perhaps even lock down defensive pairing as well, like something a few years back like Suter and Weber were in Nashville. Just no one wanted to go against them, and they really were effective at shutting down the other team's number one unit. So it's obviously there's still some pairings like that throughout the league, and you can kind of look through game logs and kind of get an idea of which situations really matter. But the key is to make sure you're taking advantage of the home teams and make kind of that to your advantage overall. On the other side as well, maybe fading certain scenarios where you think someone might be shut down, or maybe just might not hit value and from a ceiling perspective. So it's easier said than done, because hockey is really a fluid sport overall, especially with line changes. There's teams that'll get players out against different opponents either way. Even you might want to look at just from a total defensive rating for a team that might only really be relevant for 25% of the game or less, because teams are able to, again, move things around, power play time, penalty kill time, all that stuff impacts the matchups and how much a team can use last change to their advantage overall. Because sometimes from a fantasy perspective, you could actually see the opposite come into play as well. Again, to bring back a player like Bergeron or another elite defensive forward, someone like Mark Stone, they can sometimes perform better on the road. And normally the Vegas total would be a little lower for those guys, but from an individual perspective, it makes sense that they could at least see some of their defensive responsibilities be taken out of the coach's hands. Because even if it's as simple as getting more offensive zone faceoffs than normal, when a shutdown line is out there, then they're just accustomed to starting in the D zone more often or more frequently at home. It's something we really got to take advantage of, especially for some of those elite defensive players in the league. And I think it's something people probably don't look at enough. An undervalued metric for the center position in NHL DFS, because when DraftKings completely changed their scoring, or at least added some of the bonuses to their scoring in 2019, I really did a deep dive into each position, tried to really get an idea of what metrics and what time frames really matter in terms of trying to be predictive, not descriptive, in my fantasy hockey projections. So what I found was that Corsi 4 was extremely predictive across the board in terms of trying to target stacks, good game environment on both sides, but really at the center position, there's just a huge consistency spike there, which was really interesting. And I think it makes a little bit of sense just because centermen are controlling a play, driving a ton of opportunities overall, but just giving it a bump in my model definitely really helped in terms of the center position in particular. So I think that Corsi 4, yes, it's important across the board, but make sure that you really look at it in terms of your center decisions, because it's something that, for whatever reason, really is predictive in comparison to some of the other metrics out there for centermen in general. So I think that one thing we should probably mention too is I always skew towards more recent stats for offensive numbers and more longer term stats for defensive numbers. So when we're looking at offensive numbers, the last 15 days, the last month, they do a really nice job of quantifying how a player is doing, or at least getting a feel for his role on that team. Power play, which line he's on. We're not always looking at studs, right? I want to get an idea of how a player is being used most recently, because that can be in constant flux depending on what team and what player we're talking about. So definitely keep that in mind. Corsi 4 over the last month, the last 15 days, I really think it's undervalued. An undervalued metric for the winger position in NHL DFS, because we know that DraftKings changed their entire scoring system in 2019 for hockey, and it is something that we should be paying attention to based on the different positions, because now that there's certain spots where maybe a guy gets the block bonus, maybe he doesn't, it's a huge difference. It's nearly an assist added to your score if you get to the 3 blocks. So we know that wingers don't block a ton of shots overall. So if we wanted to just focus on the shots on goal bonus, so 5 shots on goal, you get a pretty significant bump in your score for that as well. Wingers, it's even more impressive if you can get that block bonus. Of course, there's certain guys that can get there. I don't want to say they never can, but I'm more focused on shots on goal for the winger position. So one of the things that I found that was really predictive in terms of really targeting a ceiling for wingers is going to be power play shots over the last 15 days. So this makes a lot of sense for a couple of reasons. Like I said, wingers aren't necessarily going to get there on block shots. And so if we really only have one peripheral to work with, we want to really focus on guys that are getting shot attempts, or at least getting schemed shot attempts on the power play. We know that more goals happen at the man advantage anyways. So I think that it's a spot where if we can target these wingers that are shooting a lot more on the power play most recently, it can really add to a lot of ceiling and actually add to our floor in a lot of ways as well, especially if it helps them get to that shot bonus more often. So I think that it's an interesting spot. We've talked a little bit about this already, but really targeting offensive numbers in the short term is what I try and do more often than defensive numbers, because things can change a lot. Guys can really move up and down the lineup, but power play in particular, that's something that can be constantly changing, especially if a team is really struggling on the power play. The combinations can be changing a lot. We know certain teams really only play their first unit. So that's something that we really want to kind of take advantage of. If a guy is really thrust into a power play 1 role and they're scheming him more shots, power play shots over the last 15 days, it makes a lot of sense intuitively that that would matter a lot more for wingers, where they're more driven by shots anyways. An undervalued metric at the defense position for NHL DFS, because we know DraftKings altered their scoring to place a higher emphasis upon peripheral stats like shots on goal, on blocks. We know they have bonuses for each of those now. So 5 shots on goal, 3 block shots, you do get a nice little bonus, adds up almost to an assist in some cases. So it's just massive. And at the defense position, I really wanted to dig deep into what really matters, what was predictive, not just descriptive, but also what is a big deal that maybe people aren't paying as much attention to as they should. So one of the things that I saw right away, time on ice at the defense position, massively important in comparison to even some of the other positions. And it makes a lot of sense, right? So if we really want to try and get to these bonuses and shots and blocks, one of the things that defensemen do a ton of is they kill penalties. And a lot of them that are going to be hitting those block shot bonuses will be killing penalties. So that time on ice number is absolutely huge. And I think that there's a couple things besides just getting that block bonus that make a lot of sense. Sometimes an increase in role will really help some of those guys get there anyways that might not have gotten there otherwise. So an example this year was Oscar Klefbom. He goes down for Edmonton, and then Darnell Nurse gets thrown into just an increased role. He's playing more minutes, 26, 27 minutes a night. His floor is just massively large now because he's a guy that could get us the block bonus anyways. Now add those minutes on top of that. He's nearly a lock to get at least one of those bonuses now each and every night in any matchup. And now that he's playing on the first power play unit as well, that's just another kind of example of what an added minutes can do for the defensive position. And I know this is something that really could go towards any position, but at defense in particular, we know the floor is a little bit higher than some of these other positions like wingers that don't block shots at all. I think it's really important. I'm definitely going to be bumping it up in my model going forward. Undervalued metric for the goalie position in NHL DFS, because honestly, goalie is one of the more frustrating positions in fantasy hockey, especially on DraftKings, the way the scoring is set up, so heavily driven by if the goaltender gets a win or not. There's tons of there's nothing worse, I should say, than having a really great GPP team that just gets buried by your goalie who ends up losing in a shootout or whatever it is. It's just so big, a lot bigger than just accumulating a lot of saves. So what I'm paying attention to is just how well the team is playing lately. More specifically, goaltender win percentage over the past month. I think it's something probably people don't look at enough, but intuitively, it makes a ton of sense. The more wins a team gets, the better a goalie is likely scoring, and it could continue in the future as well, especially if teams get hot. It could be something you could ride out for a couple games, even a couple weeks. So it's actually one of the more predictive metrics I found, which I was kind of surprised about. But the more I thought about it after I kind of dug into the way the new DraftKings scoring is, it makes a lot of sense. So that's something I'm looking at. If you don't have access to that metric, you can simply just type in NHL standings on Google and you'll just see how teams are doing over the past 10 games or so. So that's something that I'm really focused on, that I actually kind of weigh pretty heavily in my decision-making process, that I think sometimes people will overlook if they're only looking at Vegas lines and kind of looking at Corsi for, Corsi against, that sort of thing. But you could back into a little bit more consistency, I think, if you just target teams that are playing well. Goaltender win percentage over the past month is going to be the undervalued metric for goalies. Pay attention to both high danger and low danger opportunities in NHL DFS. And here's how those are calculated. I promise it's not as confusing as it sounds. Each shot attempt or Corsi is taken in the offensive zone is actually assigned a value based on the area of the zone in which it's recorded. Attempts are made from the attacking team's neutral or defensive zones are excluded. So attempts from the perimeter areas are assigned a value of 1. Attempts from the house, some may call it the medium danger area of the offensive zone, but in the center, not directly in front of the net, are assigned an initial value of 2. Attempts right in the slot, directly in front of the net, are assigned a value of 3. There's actually a great graphic of this posted in my Discord if you want an exact representation of the different areas. It originally was defined from the now defunct website War on Ice, but these high danger and low danger metrics are still extremely valuable today for NHL DFS. So after we have those first assigned values, from there, we add 1 to this value if the attempt is considered a rush shot on a rebound. A rebound is technically any attempt made between 3 seconds of another blocked, missed, or save attempt without a stoppage in play in between. A rush shot is any attempt within 4 seconds of the event in the neutral defensive zone without a stoppage in play in between. So basically, these values are decreased by 1 if it's blocked. Any value with a score of 2, when it's all said and done, is considered a scoring chance. So basically what we can do is use this to target matchups where teams give up a lot of high danger chances. So chances where there's more apt to be goals, and avoiding teams that give up maybe a lot of Corsi, but a lot of low danger Corsi. Teams like Columbus, they give up a lot of shots, but it's all from kind of the perimeter. This can also really help us identify goalie plays for teams that don't give up a ton of high danger opportunities. That means the goalie, in theory, should be in a better spot to rack up more saves and let in less goals. So it's really helpful from an offensive perspective, but actually can really help from goalies as well. If somehow you've made it through all 15 of these tips and you still haven't hit that subscribe button yet, feel free to do that now. And we do have some videos right here that you might like if you want a little bit more DFS advice. Toss a like on this video before you get out here, and be sure and check out linemovement.com. I'll see you guys next time.